A free software license is a notice that grants the recipient of a piece of software extensive rights to modify and redistribute that software. These actions are usually prohibited by copyright law, but the rights holder of a piece of software can remove these restrictions by accompanying the software with a software license which grants the recipient these rights. Software using such a license is free software as conferred by the copyright holder. Some free software licenses include copyleft provisions, which require all future versions to also be distributed with these freedoms. Other, permissive, free software licenses are usually just a few lines containing the grant of rights and a disclaimer of warranty, thus also allowing distributors to add restrictions for further recipients. While historically the most widely used FOSS license has been the GNU General Public License v2, in 2015 according to Black Duck Software as also GitHub statistics, the permissive MIT license dethroned the GPL v2 to the second place while the permissive Apache license follows already at third place. History. Free software licenses before the 1980s were generally informal notices written by the developers themselves. At that time, sharing of software was common in certain developer communities and there were even questions about whether copyright law applied to software. So licenses weren't written with a view to having to be defended in court. Copyleft not yet having been invented, these early licenses were of the permissive kind. In the mid-1980s, the GNU project produced individual free software licenses for each of its software packages. An early such license was used for GNU Emacs in 1985, with subsequent revisions in 1986, 1987 and 1988 taking the name of GNU Emacs General Public License. Likewise, the similar GCC General Public License was applied to the GNU Compiler Collection, which was initially published in 1987. The original BSD license is also one of the first free software licenses, dating to 1988. In 1989, version 1 of the GNU General Public License was published. Version 2 of the GPL, released in 1991, went on to become the most widely used free software license. Starting in the mid-90s and until the mid-00, a trend began where companies of new projects wrote their own licenses, or adapting others' licenses to insert their own name. This license proliferation led to problems of complexity and license compatibility. One free software license, the GNU GPL version 2, has been brought to court, first in Germany and later in the USA. In the German case, the judge did not explicitly discuss the validity of the GPL's clauses but accepted that the GPL had to be adhered to. If the GPL were not agreed upon by the parties, defendant would notwithstanding lack the necessary rights to copy, distribute, and make the software netfilter itables publicly available. Because the defendant did not comply with the GPL, it had to cease use of the software. The U.S. case was settled before a verdict was arrived at, but at an initial hearing, Judge Saris saw no reason that the GPL would not be enforceable. Definitions. OSI-approved open source licenses. The group Open Source Initiative defines and maintains a list of approved open source licenses. OSI agrees with FSF on all widely used free software licenses, but differ from FSF's list, as it approves against the open source definition rather than the free software definition. It considers free software permissive license group to be a reference implementation of a free software license. Thus its requirements for approving licenses are different. FSF-approved free software licenses. The Free Software Foundation, the group that maintains the free software definition, maintains a non-exhaustive list of free software licenses. The Free Software Foundation prefers copyleft free software licensing rather than permissive free software licensing for most purposes. Its list distinguishes between free software licenses that are compatible or incompatible with the FSF's copyleft GNU General Public License. Restrictions in free software licenses. There exists an ongoing debate within the free software community regarding the fine line between what restrictions can be applied and still be called free. Only public domain-like licenses are restriction-free, for instance the WTFPL or the CC0 license. Permissive licenses might carry small obligations like attribution of the author but allow practically all code use cases. Certain licenses, namely the copyleft licenses, include intentionally stronger restrictions in order to force derived projects to guarantee specific rights which can't be taken away. Copyleft, the free software Sharia-like licenses written by Richard Stallman in the mid-1980s, pioneered a concept known as copyleft. Ensuing copyleft provisions stated that when modified versions of free software are distributed, they must be distributed under the same terms as the original software. Hence they are referred to as share and share alike, or quid pro quo. This results in the new software being open source as well, since copyleft ensures that later generations of the software grant the freedom to modify the code. This is free software. Non-copyleft licenses do not ensure that later generations of the software remain free. Developers who use GPL code in the product must make the source code available to anyone when they share or sell the object code. In this case, the source code must also contain any changes the developers may have made. If GPL code is used but not shared or sold, the code is not required to be made available and any changes may remain private. This permits developers and organizations to use and modify GPL code for private purposes without being required to make their changes available to the public. Supporters of GPL claim that by mandating that derivative works remain under the GPL, it fosters the growth of free software and requires equal participation by all users. Opponents of GPL claim that no license can guarantee future software availability, and that the disadvantages of GPL outweigh its advantages. Some also argue that restricting distribution makes the license less free, whereas proponents would argue that not preserving freedom during distribution would make it less free. For example, a non-copyleft license does not grant the author the freedom to see modified versions of his or her work if it gets publicly published, whereas the copyleft license does grant that freedom. Patent retaliation. During the 1990s, free software licenses began including clauses, such as patent retaliation, in order to protect against software patent litigation cases, a problem which had not previously existed. This new threat was one of the reasons for writing version 3 of the new GPL in 2006. In recent years, a term coined TiVoization describes a process where hardware restrictions are used to prevent users from running modified versions of the software on that hardware, which the TiVo device is an example of. It is viewed by the FSF as a way to turn free software to effectively non-free, and is why they have chosen to prohibit it in GPL v3. Most newly written free software licenses since the late 1990s include some form of patent retaliation clauses. These measures stipulate that one's rights under the license may be terminated if one attempts to enforce patents relating to the licensed software, under certain circumstances. As an example, the Apple Public Source license may terminate a user's rights if said user embarks on litigation proceedings against them due to patent litigation. Patent retaliation emerged in response to proliferation and abuse of software patents. Hardware restrictions. Version 3 of the new GPL includes specific language prohibiting additional restrictions being enforced by hardware restrictions and digital rights management, a practice FSF calls TiVoization. Attribution, disclaimers and notices. The majority of free software licenses require that modified software not claimed to be unmodified. Some licenses also require that copyright holders be credited. One such example is version 2 of the new GPL, which requires that interactive programs that print warranty or license information may not have these notices removed from modified versions intended for distribution. Practical problems with licenses. License compatibility. Licenses of software packages containing contradictory requirements render it impossible to combine source code from such packages in order to create new software packages. License compatibility between a copyleft license and another license is often only a one-way compatibility. This one-way compatibility characteristic is for instance criticized by the Apache Foundation, who provides the more permissive Apache license which doesn't have this characteristic. Non-copyleft licenses as the FOSS permissive licenses have a less complicated license interaction and have most often or in general better license compatibility. For example, if one license says, modified versions must mention the developers in any advertising materials, and another license says, modified versions cannot contain additional attribution requirements, then, if someone combined a software package which uses one license with a software package which uses the other, it would be impossible to distribute the combination because these contradictory requirements cannot be simultaneously fulfilled. Thus, these two packages would be license incompatible. When it comes to copyleft software licenses, they are not inherently compatible with other copyleft licenses. Even the GPL v2 is by itself not compatible with the GPL v3. Purpose of use restrictions on use of a software are generally unacceptable according the FSF, OSI, Debian, or the BSD-based distributions. Examples include prohibiting the software to be used private only, for military purposes, for comparison or benchmarking, for good use, for ethically questionable means, or in commercial organizations. Definition conflicts. As there are several defining organizations and groups who publish definitions and guidelines about FOSS licenses, notably the FSF, the OSI, the Debian project and the BSDs, there are sometimes conflicting opinions and interpretations. Permissive versus copyleft opinions. Many users and developers of BSD-based operating systems have a different position on licensing. The main difference is the belief that the copyleft licenses, particularly the new general public license, are undesirably complicated and/or restrictive. The GPL requires any derivative work to also be released according to the GPL, while the BSD license does not. As a result, BSD code can be used in proprietary software that only acknowledges the authors. For instance, the IP stack in Microsoft Windows NT 3.1 and Mac OS X are derived from BSD licensed software. Supporters of the BSD license argue that it is more free than the GPL because it grants the right to do anything with the source code, provided that the attribution is preserved. For example, users might incorporate the BSD licensed code into proprietary products. The approach has led to BSD code being used in common, widely used proprietary software. In response, proponents of the GPL point out that once code becomes proprietary, users lack the freedoms that define free software. As a result, they consider the BSD license less free than the GPL, and freedom a distinct concept from the lack of any restrictions. Since the BSD license restricts the right of developers to have changes recontributed to the community, neither it nor the GPL is free, in the sense of lacking any restrictions. Code licensed under a permissive free software license, such as the BSD license, can be incorporated into copylefted projects. Such code is thus GPL compatible. There is no need to secure the consent of the original authors. In contrast, code under the GPL cannot be relicensed under the BSD license without securing the consent of all copyright holders. Thus, the two licenses are compatible, but the combination as a whole must be distributed under the terms of the GPL, not the permissive license. Existing free software BSDs tend to avoid including software licensed under the GPL in the core operating system, or the base system, except as a last resort when alternatives are non-existent or vastly less capable, such as with GCC. For example, starting with FreeBSD 10.0 release, GCC was replaced to the Clang LLVM compiler, perhaps primarily for this reason. The OpenBSD project has acted to remove GPL licensed tools in favor of BSD licensed alternatives, some newly written and some adapted from older code. Debian. The Debian project uses the criteria laid out in its Debian Free Software Guidelines. The only notable cases where Debian and Free Software Foundation disagree are over the artistic license and the new free documentation license. Debian accepts the original artistic license as being a free software license, but FSF disagrees. This has very little impact, however, since the artistic license is almost always used in a dual license setup, along with the new general public license. Controversial borderline cases. The vast majority of free software uses undisputed free software licenses. However, there have been many debates over whether or not certain other licenses qualify for the definition. Examples of licenses that provoked debate were the 1X series of the Apple Public Source license, which were accepted by the Open Source Initiative but not by the Free Software Foundation or Debian, and the Real Networks Public Source license, which was accepted by Open Source Initiative and Free Software Foundation but not by Debian. Also, the FSF recommended new free documentation license, which is incompatible with the GPL, was considered non-free by the Debian project around 2006, and Nathaniel Nerode. The FSF argues that documentation is qualitatively different from software and is subject to different requirements. Debian accepted in a later resolution the new FDL to comply with the Debian Free Software Guidelines, while calling the license still not free of trouble when the controversial invariant section is removed. Most new documentation includes invariant sections. Similarly, the Floss Manuals Foundation, an organization devoted to creating manuals for free software, decided to eschew the GFDL in favor of the GPL for its texts in 2007, citing the incompatibility between the two, difficulties in implementing the GFDL, and the fact that the GFDL does not allow for easy duplication and modification, especially for digital documentation.